A wealthy man, known for his arrogance, humiliates a black waitress by forcing her to play the piano in front of his guests as a cruel joke. But the moment her fingers touch the keys, the room falls silent. Her extraordinary talent transforms the mockery into awe, leaving him utterly speechless. What happens next will challenge everything he thought he knew. Don't miss this powerful story. Subscribe now to see how it all unfolds. The chandelier lights of the lavish restaurant reflected off polished marble floors, casting an opulent glow over the dining room. It was a Friday evening, and the place was bustling with the hum of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. In the corner, a grand piano stood unused, a decorative afterthought for a restaurant where everything screamed extravagance. Charles Remington entered, his presence commanding the room like a thunderstorm. A self-made billionaire with sharp suits and sharper words, he was infamous for his arrogance. His entourage, three equally wealthy friends, trailed behind, their laughter booming, as if they owned the air itself. "Ah, this place will do," Charles said, surveying the room with the detached gaze of a king choosing his throne. Amara Johnson noticed them immediately. She always did when customers like them came in, the kind who looked at waitstaff like moving furniture. Adjusting her apron, she approached their table with the practiced smile she had perfected over years of working in upscale restaurants. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but warm. "May I start you off with something to drink?" Charles barely looked at her. "A bottle of your best wine, whatever's expensive." "Yes, sir," Amara replied, hiding the irritation bubbling under her professional mask. As she moved toward the bar, she caught snippets of their conversation. "Did you see the way she smiled?" One of Charles's friends chuckled. "Like she actually enjoys this job." Charles smirked. "These black women always do. It's either that or they lose their tips." Amara's fingers tightened around her notepad, but she kept walking. This wasn't the first time she'd dealt with men like them, and it wouldn't be the last. By the time she returned with the wine, the group's conversation had turned to business deals and vacations, peppered with condescending remarks about everything from the food to the decor. "Excuse me," Charles said suddenly, his voice cutting through the air as she poured the wine. "What's your name?" Amara hesitated. "Amara, sir." "Amara," he repeated, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "Tell me, Amara, do you have any talents? Besides carrying plates, of course." His friends laughed, and Amara felt her cheeks flush. "I play the piano," she said before she could stop herself. Charles raised an eyebrow, glancing at the grand piano in the corner. "The piano? Really? That thing over there?" "Yes," Amara said, standing a little straighter. "My grandmother taught me." Charles's grin widened. "Why don't you play something for us then? Show us this talent of yours." "Sir, I'm working right now." "Nonsense," he interrupted. "I'm sure your manager won't mind. In fact, I'll tip you double if you entertain us." Amara froze. She could feel the eyes of the restaurant on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down like a storm cloud. A fleeting memory crossed her mind. She was 8 years old, sitting beside her grandmother at a battered upright piano in their modest living room. "Feel the keys, Amara," her grandmother had said. "They're more than wood and ivory. They're your voice when words fail you." Her grandmother's music had been a sanctuary, a place where the world's judgments couldn't reach. "Fine," Amara said, her voice steady but low. "I'll play." Charles blinked, surprised by her defiance, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Good, let's see what you've got." Amara walked toward the piano, her steps measured and deliberate. The dining room fell silent, the clinking of silverware ceasing as patrons turned to watch. She sat down, her hands hovering over the keys, trembling slightly. For a moment, doubt clawed at her. Her fingers hovered over the piano keys, her nerves tightening like a coiled spring. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder as people leaned forward, eager to see what the fuss was about. She could feel Charles's gaze boring into her back, his smirk practically audible. Her stomach churned with a mix of fear and anger. This wasn't just about playing the piano. This was about being put on display, her dignity dangled like bait for the entertainment of men who saw her as little more than a caricature. "Whenever you're ready, Amara." Charles called out, his voice dripping with condescension. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the cold ivory. Memories flooded her mind, uninvited but vivid. She remembered herself at 13, and her grandmother sitting beside her at the piano. "Play it again," her grandmother said gently. "But I keep messing up," young Amara muttered, frustrated tears pooling in her eyes. "And you'll mess up again," her grandmother replied, her voice kind but firm. "But every mistake teaches you something. Music isn't about perfection, Amara. It's about telling your truth, even if your voice shakes." Her voice was shaking now, but Amara tightened her resolve. Charles wanted a performance, and she'd give him one. But not for his amusement. She'd do it for herself. "Amara," a voice whispered behind her. She turned slightly and saw Jake, a fellow waiter who had always been a quiet but kind presence in her life. "You've got this," Jake said, his expression earnest. "You're way better than any of them think." His words steadied her. She nodded, turning back to the piano. Her hands pressed down on the keys, producing a simple, hesitant melody. A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Amara ignored them. "Predictable," one of Charles's friends muttered, leaning back in his chair. But then her fingers started to move faster, the notes blending into a rich, soulful melody that filled the room. The laughter stopped. The music swelled, weaving a story of loss, resilience, and defiance. Amara poured every ounce of emotion into the performance, her struggles, her dreams, her anger at being underestimated. The dining room fell into a stunned silence, the only sound the hauntingly beautiful music that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. At the table, Charles's smirk faded. He exchanged uncertain glances with his friends, his earlier confidence replaced by something unrecognizable, unease. "She's good," one of them whispered, as if admitting it aloud would shatter their reality. "Good?" Charles scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "She's decent." But even as he said it, he couldn't look away. For Amara, the room disappeared. There was no Charles, no crowd, no restaurant. It was just her and the piano, a conversation between her heart and the keys. As the song reached its crescendo, she felt a tear slide down her cheek, but she didn't care. This wasn't about holding back anymore. When she struck the final chord, the sound lingered in the air like an echo of something timeless. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then building into a thunderous ovation. Patrons stood from their tables, clapping and cheering. Amara slowly turned on the bench, her face calm, but her heart pounding. Charles sat frozen, his hands clasped tightly together. His expression was unreadable, but the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed him. She stood, smoothing her apron as if nothing had happened. Walking past Charles's table, she met his gaze briefly. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir," she said, her voice steady but laced with quiet defiance. And with that, she returned to her station, leaving behind a room of astonished diners and a man who, for the first time in years, was at a loss for words. At the piano, a small crowd had gathered, whispering excitedly. The patrons of this upscale restaurant weren't used to surprises, and Amara's performance had shattered their evening's predictability. At his table, Charles sat stiffly, the faint hum of conversation returning to the room around him. His friends exchanged incredulous looks, their smugness wiped clean. "Who would have thought?" one of them murmured, breaking the awkward silence. Charles snapped out of his daze. "She's practiced, that's all. Anyone can be good at something if they spend enough time on it." "Come on, Charles," another friend said, still staring at the piano. "That wasn't just practice, that was something else." Charles scowled, his fingers drumming against the table. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, and he certainly wasn't used to being humbled by someone he had dismissed as insignificant. Behind the service station, Amara leaned against the counter, her knees threatening to give out. Jake appeared beside her, grinning from ear to ear. "That was incredible," he said, keeping his voice low. "You should have seen their faces." Amara let out a shaky laugh. "I couldn't even see straight. I just played." "Well, you did more than that. You owned the room." She glanced toward the dining area, where customers were still whispering and glancing her way. Heat rose to her cheeks. I wasn't trying to make a scene. Maybe not, Jake said. But you did something way better. You made them listen. Among the diners was Evelyn Harper, a renowned music critic known for her sharp reviews and discerning ear. She had been dining with a friend when Amara's music silenced the room. Now she leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the young waitress. "Did you catch her name?" Evelyn asked her companion. "No, but she works here, I think." Evelyn nodded slowly, her mind already spinning. Talent like that didn't come along every day, and she wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. Unable to let his ego rest, Charles rose from his seat and approached the service station. Amara straightened when she saw him coming, her expression neutral but her hands tightening around the edge of the counter. "Well," he began, his tone carefully measured. "That was unexpected." "Thank you," Amara said, keeping her voice polite but cool. Charles glanced around, ensuring they had the attention of nearby diners. "You're quite talented. I'll give you that." "I appreciate the compliment," Amara said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure it was one. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "But tell me, why are you wasting that talent here? Surely you've considered something bigger." Amara met his gaze, unflinching. "This job pays my bills, sir. Not everyone has the luxury of doing what they love full-time." Charles smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Fair enough. But if you ever decide to aim higher, perhaps I can help." Amara's lips twitched into a tight smile. "I'll keep that in mind." As Charles returned to his table, Amara's mind churned. His words weren't just patronizing. They were a reminder of the barriers she'd faced her entire life. Talent alone had never been enough for people like her. Yet tonight had been different. For once, she had silenced the doubts. Not just her own, but everyone else's. Jake nudged her. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said, exhaling slowly. "I think I am." A few diners approached Amara as they left, offering words of praise. One older woman clasped her hands warmly. "You have a gift, my dear. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Amara thanked her, each kind word chipping away at the fear and doubt she'd carried for years. At the back of the room, Evelyn Harper scribbled something into a notebook before quietly leaving. Back at his table, Charles remained uncharacteristically quiet. His friends were still talking about Amara, their earlier bravado replaced with genuine admiration. "That was something else," one of them said. "You don't see talent like that every day." Charles forced a laugh. "Let's not get carried away. It was just a party trick." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd witnessed something profound, and that he had played a part in exposing it. The next morning, Amara woke up to the soft hum of her alarm clock. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night in her mind. The tension, the applause, and Charles's smug expression dissolving into something more human. It all felt surreal. After a quick breakfast, she checked her phone. To her surprise, she had several missed messages from Jake. It read, "You're not going to believe this. People are still talking about you at the restaurant. Some woman even left her card for you, said she's a music critic." Amara froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. A critic? Her pulse quickened. She had played for herself, to reclaim her dignity, not expecting her performance to ripple beyond that moment. Curiosity got the better of her, and she called Jake. "Morning, Maestro," he greeted, his voice brimming with excitement. "Morning," Amara replied cautiously. "What's this about a critic?" "Her name's Evelyn Harper," Jake explained. "She left a card for you, said you had something special and she wanted to talk." Amara's breath hitched. "Evelyn Harper? The Evelyn Harper? You've heard of her?" "Of course. She's like legendary. Her reviews make or break careers." "Well, she seemed pretty impressed," Jake said. "She wants you to call her." Meanwhile, Charles sat in his penthouse apartment, staring out over the city skyline. His phone buzzed with messages from his friends. "I still can't wrap my head around it," one of them wrote, his tone filled with awe. "That waitress, of all people, playing like that? Honestly, she's better than half the performers I've shelled out money to see." Charles scoffed and tossed his phone aside. The conversation grated on him. He prided himself on being the smartest, most talented person in any room, Yet last night, a waitress had stolen the spotlight. He couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation, masked by his growing curiosity. Who was this Amara Johnson, and why had her music affected him so deeply? Amara stared at Evelyn Harper's business card, her emotions swinging between excitement and fear. This was the kind of opportunity musicians dreamed of, but was she ready for it? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. "Hi, Mom," Amara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hi, sweetheart. I just wanted to check in. How was work last night?" Amara hesitated, then decided to tell her the truth. "Something unexpected happened. I played the piano at the restaurant, and people seemed to really like it. A music critic even left me her card." Her mother's voice softened. "Your grandmother always said you had a gift, Amara. Maybe this is your chance to show the world." Amara's chest tightened. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if it's just a fluke?" "Sweetheart, talent like yours isn't a fluke. It's a blessing. Don't let fear hold you back." Later that day, as Amara walked to the restaurant to start her shift, she spotted Charles waiting outside. Her stomach sank. She considered turning around, but he saw her before she could retreat. "Amara," he called out, his voice unusually subdued. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "I wanted to talk," he said, stepping closer. "About last night." Amara folded her arms. "What about it?" Charles hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "You surprised me, that's all." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect a waitress to have talent?" "That's not what I meant," Charles said quickly. "I underestimated you. I won't make that mistake again." Amara tilted her head, studying him. "Why are you really here?" Charles sighed. "I've been thinking. I have connections. People who could help you take your music to the next level. If you're interested." Amara narrowed her eyes. "And what would you get out of it?" He smiled faintly. "Consider it my way of making amends. Besides, I'd like to see what you're capable of." That evening, Amara finally worked up the courage to call Evelyn Harper. "Amara Johnson," Evelyn's smooth, authoritative voice answered. "I've been expecting your call." "Thank you for leaving your card," Amara said, her voice shaky. "I didn't expect anyone to notice my performance." "Not notice? My dear, you captivated an entire room. That's not something people forget easily." Evelyn explained that she was hosting a private showcase in a few weeks, featuring undiscovered talent. "I'd like you to perform," she said. Amara's stomach flipped. "Perform? But I'm just a waitress. I've never done anything like this before." "You're not just anything," Evelyn countered. "You're an artist. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise." Amara hung up the phone, her mind racing. The opportunity was exhilarating, but terrifying. Could she really step into a world she'd only dreamed of? As she cleaned up after her shift, Jake approached her. "You okay? You've been quiet all night." "I got invited to a showcase," she admitted. "But I don't know if I can do it." Jake smiled. "You can, and you should. The Amara I saw last night isn't afraid of anything." Amara glanced toward the grand piano in the corner, its presence both daunting and inviting. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe this was her moment to prove she was more than anyone had ever given her credit for. Amara stood in her modest apartment, staring at the business card Evelyn Harper had given her. It felt heavy in her hand, the weight of possibility pressing down on her. With a deep breath, she placed the card on her desk and opened her notebook, scribbling a list of everything she needed to do to prepare for the showcase. The first order of business was selecting the perfect piece to perform, something that would showcase her talent and leave a lasting impression. Next came the relentless hours of practice, pouring every ounce of energy into perfecting each note. Then, there was the task of finding an outfit that didn't shout, "Waitress," something that reflected the artist she was becoming. But the hardest challenge of all? Overcoming her fear of failure. That last hurdle loomed larger than anything else, threatening to undo everything she had worked so hard to achieve. The next day, Charles showed up at the restaurant again, this time waiting for her after her shift. "Do you have a habit of ambushing people at their jobs?" Amara asked, annoyed but curious. Charles smirked. Let's just say I'm persistent. I wanted to follow up on my offer. I told you I'm not interested in charity, Amara replied, crossing her arms. It's not charity, Charles insisted. It's an investment. You have talent, and I know people who could open doors for you. All I want is to help. Amara studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. She had to admit, his persistence was unusual. Why do you care so much? Charles hesitated, his confident facade faltering for a moment. Maybe I'm trying to prove something, to myself more than anyone else. Amara raised an eyebrow. And what's that? That I'm capable of recognizing greatness when I see it, he said, his tone quieter than she expected. Her defenses softened slightly. I'll think about it. That evening, Amara called Evelyn Harper to discuss the showcase. I don't know what to play, she confessed. Everything feels too small or too safe. Evelyn chuckled. Play something that scares you. The best performances come from the edge of fear. Amara thought about her grandmother's words, how music wasn't about perfection, but about truth. She decided to compose something original, a piece that reflected her journey. Amara spent every free moment at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys as she worked through melodies and themes. Her first drafts were clumsy, but she refused to give up. Jake often stopped by the restaurant after his shifts to listen. You're getting better every day, he said one evening as she played a section of her new piece. Better isn't good enough, Amara muttered, her frustration evident. Jake leaned against the piano. You're too hard on yourself. Just remember why you're doing this. It's not to impress anyone. It's to share your story. His words struck a chord, and Amara found herself pouring even more of her emotions into the music. Despite her reservations, Amara decided to hear Charles out. He invited her to his office, a sleek space filled with modern art and expensive furniture. I've arranged a meeting with a talent manager, he told her. They'll be at the showcase, so make it count. Amara nodded, still wary of his motives. Thank you. I appreciate the effort. Charles smiled, his expression oddly genuine. Don't make me regret it. As the showcase approached, Amara's nerves threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong among the other performers. One evening, she visited her grandmother's grave, seeking solace. I'm scared, Nana, she whispered. What if I'm not good enough? The wind rustled through the trees, and she imagined her grandmother's voice in the breeze. Music isn't about them, Amara. It's about you. Her resolve strengthened. She returned to her piano and practiced with renewed determination. While shopping for a dress for the showcase, Amara ran into Evelyn Harper. I hope you're ready for Saturday, Evelyn said, her tone warm but firm. I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Amara replied, clutching a modest black dress she had chosen. Evelyn eyed the dress and smiled. It's not about the outfit, dear. It's about the presence you bring to the stage. As the night of the showcase drew closer, the restaurant buzzed with anticipation. News of Amara's performance had spread, and regular patrons began asking about her. Charles, too, seemed more invested than ever, stopping by frequently to check on her progress. Don't let them see you doubt yourself, he told her one evening. Confidence is half the battle. Amara smirked. Funny, coming from someone who tried to humiliate me a week ago. Charles chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Fair point, but I'm trying to make up for it. The night before the showcase, Amara sat at the piano in the empty restaurant, playing her piece one last time. The music filled the space, a tapestry of sorrow, hope, and resilience. Jake stood nearby, clapping softly when she finished. You're ready, he said with certainty. Amara nodded, her fear giving way to determination. She was ready to take the stage, and the world, by storm. The night of the showcase arrived, and the air in the venue hummed with the excited energy of talent, ambition, and anticipation. Amara stood backstage, feeling the thrum of the crowd in the walls, each heartbeat reverberating through her chest. She adjusted her black dress, its simplicity hiding the nerves that swirled within her. As the minutes ticked by, Amara's thoughts circled back to the piano, the instrument she had come to see as both a challenge and a sanctuary. What if she wasn't enough? What if the performance fell flat? But she couldn't let herself be consumed by the what-ifs anymore. This was her chance to prove that she belonged here, no matter who was watching. Back in the main room, the guests mingled, sipping champagne and chatting about the talent they were about to witness. Amara caught a glimpse of Charles among the crowd, looking surprisingly relaxed for someone who had once seen her as a mere servant. He approached her backstage with a confident but encouraging smile. "You look the part," he said, his voice low but warm. "Are you ready?" Amara glanced up at him. For once, his usual arrogance was replaced by a genuine look of anticipation. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Charles gave her a nod of approval. "You've got this." He turned to walk back into the main area, but paused. "And remember, this isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about proving it to yourself." Amara watched him for a moment, the weight of his words settling in. She had been fighting so hard to prove her worth to the world, but tonight she realized it was about something deeper. She was proving her worth to herself. The showcase began with a flourish, the host introducing each performer as they took their turn on stage. Amara could hear the murmurs of the crowd, their expectations palpable. "Next up," the host announced, "we have Amara Johnson, a self-taught pianist with a passion for music that speaks to the soul. Please welcome her to the stage." As her name rang out, a wave of nerves flooded her. It was time. She could feel all eyes on her as she walked toward the grand piano under the spotlight, her hands clammy and her mind racing. She sat at the piano, inhaling deeply to calm herself. The crowd seemed far away as she adjusted the stool, her fingers brushing against the keys before she began. The first few notes of her composition were shaky, but then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the music began to flow. She poured every ounce of her soul into the piece, her fingers gliding across the keys with a fluidity she had never known. The piano became an extension of her, the rhythm of her heart mirrored in each note. The crowd fell silent, entranced. Even the faint hum of whispers died down. The only sound that filled the room was the music, and for the first time in her life, Amara didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged. Her eyes closed as the music swelled, telling the story of her life, her struggles, her triumphs, the weight of the dreams she had carried all these years. With every note, she shed the layers of doubt and fear that had once defined her. The final chords rang out, lingering in the air as the room sat in stunned silence. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. No one spoke. Amara held her breath, waiting for the response. Then, slowly, the applause began, growing louder and louder as the audience stood, clapping in unison. Amara's heart raced in her chest as she stood up, bowing briefly before walking off the stage. The applause still echoed in her ears, but her legs felt like jelly. She made her way backstage, trying to hold herself together. Jake was waiting for her, a wide grin on his face. "You did it," he said, his voice full of pride. "That was something else." Amara smiled, but the adrenaline was still rushing through her veins. "I can't believe it." Evelyn Harper, who had been sitting front and center, made her way backstage with a purposeful stride. Amara caught sight of her and straightened, suddenly feeling the weight of the critics' gaze. "You were incredible," Evelyn said, her voice warm yet professional. "That performance was everything I expected and more. I can see the emotion you poured into it. That's what sets you apart." Amara swallowed, trying to calm her racing heart. "Thank you. I'm glad it resonated." "I'm not the only one who was impressed," Evelyn continued. "You've got a real shot at something big, Amara. I can help you get there." Her words were like a spark, igniting something deep within Amara. "I don't know what to say." Evelyn smiled. "Don't say anything. Just know that you're a rare talent, and I'm here to help you make the most of it." Charles appeared soon after, pushing his way through the crowd. He was grinning, his usual air of confidence returning. "You were phenomenal," he said, his voice sincere. "I knew you had it in you." Amara met his gaze, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief on her face. "I didn't expect to get such a response." "You deserve it," Charles replied. "And if you ever need help, whether it's introductions or more guidance, don't hesitate to reach out." For a moment, their eyes locked. Amara, who had once seen Charles as an arrogant man trying to put her down, now saw something different. He was, in his own way, trying to lift her up. As the showcase wrapped up, Amara found herself surrounded by guests, some offering congratulations and others offering business cards or phone numbers. The world she had once thought was out of her reach now seemed to be within her grasp. Jake, who had been her rock throughout the entire process, approached with a proud smile. "So, what's next?" Amara paused, her mind racing. The night had changed everything. She had made her mark, and now the world would know her name. "I'm not sure yet," she said, a glint of excitement in her eyes. "But I know one thing. This is just the beginning." The weeks following the showcase were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and unexpected opportunities. Amara's performance had sparked interest from several influential figures in the music industry, but she found herself standing at a crossroads. The spotlight had shifted onto her, but with it came the weight of decisions she hadn't anticipated. Amara's phone buzzed constantly, notifications flooding in from social media and various emails. Evelyn Harper had connected her with several managers, agents, and even a few renowned composers who wanted to collaborate with her. At first, the attention was overwhelming. The pressure to keep up with the demands felt like a constant reminder that her life had changed. No longer was she just Amara, the waitress. She was Amara, the self-taught pianist who had stunned the music world. Evelyn, sensing her apprehension, called her one evening. "You're in demand, Amara," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "But you have to think about what you really want. These people are offering you opportunities, but they come with their own set of expectations." "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Amara admitted, pacing around her apartment. "It feels like I'm drowning in offers, and I'm not sure what's real and what's just noise." Evelyn was silent for a moment. "Take your time. The right opportunity will present itself, but don't let fear make the decision for you." Amara had kept in touch with Charles, though their relationship remained professional. He'd offered her advice and resources, but had stayed out of her personal life, something she appreciated. He continued to keep an eye on her career, offering insights and introductions whenever possible. One afternoon, he called her. "Amara, there's a major producer in town who's looking for fresh talent. He's been following your progress, and I think he'd be a great fit for your sound." "I've heard the name," Amara replied, her fingers nervously tapping on the edge of the kitchen counter. "But I don't know if I'm ready for someone that high profile. I don't want to lose myself in the process." Charles chuckled. "You won't. But you have to understand that the people who can get you to the next level aren't always going to care about your backstory. They'll care about the music, and they'll care about how you present yourself." Amara's thoughts drifted back to her grandmother's teachings. "It's not about perfection, Amara. It's about sharing your truth through the music." She realized that Charles's words weren't as cold as they used to feel. There was truth in them, and they were a reminder that her journey was bigger than any one person or moment. "I'll think about it," Amara said, hanging up the phone with a sense of purpose. As Amara worked through the chaos of new offers, Jake continued to support her. He was her grounding force, the one person who saw her as more than a potential superstar. He saw Amara as the woman who had poured her heart into every note, the woman who had fought to break free of the life she once knew. "You're overthinking it again," Jake teased one evening as they sat in her apartment, taking a break from the frenzy. "I'm not overthinking," Amara replied, frustrated. "I just want to make sure I don't make the wrong decision." Jake smiled and took her hand. "You won't. You've got this." She sighed, leaning against him. "I keep thinking about how this all started. The showcase, the piano, even the people like Charles." She trailed off, her thoughts tangled in the complexity of it all. "You're still you," Jake said softly, "and nothing about that is going to change. Just don't let all the noise drown out what matters." As the weeks wore on, Amara met with a few agents, listening to their pitches, and evaluating what they could offer her. One agent, Richard Green, was particularly persistent, offering her a contract that included national tours and media appearances. "I'm offering you a platform, Amara," Richard said during their meeting. "You're incredibly talented, and I can make sure the world hears your music. All I need is your commitment." The offer was tempting, too tempting. But Amara hesitated, the fear of losing herself creeping back. Richard was all business, focusing solely on how Amara could be marketed, not on her growth as an artist. "Do you really want to be a commodity?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Richard's smile didn't falter. "Everyone is a commodity, Amara. It's about how you package it. You're either in the game or you're left behind." Her gut twisted at his words, and she knew in that moment that this wasn't the right path. It was in the midst of all these decisions that Amara felt a pull to reconnect with the one person who had always believed in her grandmother. She visited her grandmother's grave, the familiar sense of peace washing over her as she sat beside the headstone. "I don't know what to do, Nana," she whispered. "Everything's moving so fast, and I feel like I'm losing touch with why I started playing in the first place." She closed her eyes, letting the wind carry her thoughts. The answers weren't clear at first, but slowly, she realized that her grandmother had always taught her to play from the heart, not to follow the crowd, but to remain true to her own voice. With a deep breath, Amara stood up, feeling a new sense of clarity. The final breakthrough came when Amara decided to walk away from Richard Green's offer. It wasn't easy, but it was right. Instead, she chose to work with Evelyn, who had always supported her growth as an artist, not as a product. "I don't want to be a part of a machine," Amara told Evelyn over the phone. "I want to create music that matters, something that speaks to the people, not just the market." Evelyn was quiet for a moment before responding. "That's what I admire about you, Amara. You know who you are, and that's worth more than any contract." Amara smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief. She wasn't going to let anyone else define her success. She was going to do it on her own terms. Charles was, unsurprisingly, aware of Amara's decision. He approached her one evening at the restaurant, his usual smirk replaced by something more contemplative. "You turned down Green's offer?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I did," Amara replied, her voice firm. "It wasn't right for me." Charles nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Smart. Not every opportunity is worth chasing, especially if it means losing yourself in the process." Amara tilted her head. "I never thought you'd say that." Charles chuckled. "I'm not all bad, you know, just misunderstood." They shared a brief, understanding moment before Amara excused herself to return to her practice. She was no longer the woman who feared failure. She was the artist who had found her voice, and now it was time to let the world hear it. As Amara sat at the piano, her fingers danced across the keys once more, the music filling her small apartment. The room was quiet, but the world outside felt louder than ever. She had made her decision, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, she was no longer afraid. The music, her music, would guide her forward. As Amara settled into her new rhythm, the pace of her life changed once again, but this time, it was on her terms. She had opted for a more personal and deliberate approach, turning down the rush of the mainstream music industry. The path she chose wasn't the easiest, but it was one she believed in. Evelyn remained her steadfast mentor throughout the transition. The initial months were filled with small performances, private concerts, and collaborations with local artists who valued Amara's unique style. Each gig was an opportunity for Amara to refine her craft, to perfect the melodies that had lived in her heart for years. Slowly, she began to build a loyal following, people who saw her as more than a performer. They saw her as an artist who created stories through her music. One evening, after a particularly moving performance at a local jazz bar, Amara sat backstage, catching her breath. The lights outside the club were dimming as the last notes of her set hung in the air. Jake, who had attended every one of her performances, was the first to greet her. "You were amazing," he said, giving her a proud smile. Amara grinned, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "It feels good, you know. This is where I belong." As they spoke, a woman approached with a business card in hand. I'm Kendra Price, the woman introduced herself. I've been following your work, and I think you're ready for the next step. I work for a company that promotes independent artists like you. We don't sell you out for commercial appeal, we focus on keeping your integrity. Amara's heart raced. This was it, the moment she had worked for, the validation that her music mattered. She hesitated for a moment, looking at Jake, who gave her an encouraging nod. I'm interested, Amara said, taking the card. Let's talk. A few weeks later, Amara found herself in a recording studio, a stark contrast to the intimate venues she was used to. The studio was filled with equipment, lights, and a team that was there to bring her music to life. Kendra's company had offered her a contract, but it wasn't a traditional one. The focus was on creating music that stayed true to Amara's artistic vision while allowing her to expand her reach. She worked tirelessly on a new album, pouring her emotions into each track, reflecting her journey, the struggles, the growth, and the ultimate triumph. With every note, she felt closer to herself. The collaboration with other musicians brought new energy, yet the core of the album remained hers. Charles had even reached out, offering his support and praise for how she was handling everything. "You've found your lane," he said during one of their conversations. "You've done what others only dream of, staying true to your roots." Amara smiled at his words. Despite their differences, she had gained a newfound respect for Charles. His bluntness had, in a strange way, given her the tough love she needed to succeed. When the album was finally ready, it was released independently but quickly gained attention, not only from her growing fan base, but also from critics who appreciated the raw emotion in her music. The album's success wasn't defined by mainstream accolades or chart rankings. It was measured by the way it resonated with listeners. Radio stations began to play her songs, and she was invited to perform on podcasts and late-night shows. Each appearance was a small victory, a reminder that her decision to trust her instincts had paid off. At one interview, the host asked, "You're not what we expect from a traditional artist. How did you carve out this space for yourself?" Amara paused, considering the question. "I didn't carve it out, I just walked into it. I stopped thinking about what others expected of me and started thinking about what I could offer to the world. My music is for anyone who needs to hear it, not just the ones who are already looking for it." Her words resonated with the audience, and the next day, her social media followers surged. The world was beginning to take notice of Amara, not just as a performer, but as a voice that carried something meaningful. Despite her growing success, Amara never forgot where she came from. She made sure to stay grounded and stayed close to the people who had supported her from the beginning. Jake remained her anchor, always there to remind her of the reasons she started in the first place. One evening, after a particularly long day of rehearsals, she was back at her favorite restaurant, where she had once worked as a waitress. As she sat down to have dinner, she noticed a familiar face across the room. It was one of her old colleagues from the restaurant, a waitress named Tara. Tara had always believed in Amara's talent, often encouraging her to pursue her music dreams. Amara stood up, walking over to greet her. "Tara, you won't believe it. I'm recording my own album," Amara said, her eyes shining with excitement. Tara's face lit up with a grin. "I knew you'd make it. You always had something special. You just had to believe in yourself." They sat and talked for hours, catching up on everything. How Tara had gotten married, how Amara had pushed through the tough times to reach her dreams. For Amara, it was a reminder that her journey wasn't just about the music. It was about the people who had helped her along the way, the ones who had been there even before she became a name. The final moment of realization came during a gala event hosted by Evelyn. It was an elegant evening, with industry professionals and artists from all walks of life. Amara was invited as a special guest, and Charles, who had continued to offer her guidance, was also present. During the event, he approached her, his usual smirk replaced with something softer. "You did well, Amara," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I wasn't sure you had it in you, but I'm glad you proved me wrong." Amara looked at him, finally seeing him for what he was. A man who had started as a skeptic, but had come to respect her on her terms. "Thank you, Charles," she replied. "You helped me find my voice." As the gala wound down, Amara found herself standing by the window, looking out at the city. The lights sparkled like stars, and for the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider in a world that had once felt so foreign. She had fought for every step of her success, but now she was ready to embrace whatever the future had in store for her. Her music was no longer just her passion, it was her legacy. And as she walked away from the gala, with her heart full of hope and excitement for what was to come, she knew that this was just the beginning of her story. The journey from waitress to celebrated pianist had been full of challenges and triumphs, but Amara had found her place in the world. She wasn't just a pianist, she was an artist, a voice for those who felt overlooked, and a reminder that authenticity and dedication could carve a path to greatness. The world was waiting for her, and Amara was finally ready to embrace it. On a Monday morning, she decided to once again visit the restaurant she once worked at. The soft hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the faint aroma of freshly baked bread all felt like echoes of a life she had left behind. But tonight, she wasn't here to serve tables or escape her reality. She was here to reflect, to acknowledge the journey that had brought her to this moment. She walked through the room, her steps steady but unhurried, drawing only a few glances from the patrons. Most people didn't recognize her. The transformation from waitress to rising musical star was more internal than external. But that was fine by Amara. She wasn't here for recognition, she was here for closure. When she reached the corner where the old upright piano stood, her chest tightened. It was still there, tucked into its usual spot by the window. The wood was scratched and worn, the keys slightly yellowed, but to Amara, it was the most beautiful instrument she'd ever seen. It was on this piano that her life had changed forever. She slid onto the bench, the creak of the wood beneath her like a whisper from the past. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, her touch feather soft, as if afraid to disturb the memories embedded in them. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and it all came flooding back. The night Charles had taunted her, the humiliation she'd felt, and the fire it had ignited within her. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. She could still hear the laughter, the smugness in Charles's voice as he tried to use her as the punchline to his joke. Back then, she'd felt small, insignificant, and powerless. But when her fingers found the keys that night, something inside her had shifted. She hadn't played for him or the audience. She'd played for herself, for the grandmother who had taught her to love music, and for the dreams she'd buried under the weight of her circumstances. That performance had been a turning point, the moment she discovered her own strength. Amara opened her eyes, staring at the piano with a bittersweet smile. How far she had come since then. Her journey had been anything but easy, filled with self-doubt, setbacks, and decisions that had tested her resolve. But she had faced them all and emerged stronger. Her mind drifted to the faces that had shaped her path. Evelyn Harper, who had given her a chance when no one else would. Jake, who had stood by her through every triumph and stumble. Tara, who had cheered her on from the sidelines. And even Charles, whose arrogance had unwittingly pushed her toward greatness. Each of them had played a role, but the real miracle, Amara realized, was within herself. She had taken the pain, the fear, and the uncertainty and turned them into something beautiful. Her music wasn't just notes and melodies. It was her story, her truth, and her gift to the world. Amara glanced around the restaurant, her gaze falling on the tables she used to serve. She remembered the long hours, the exhaustion, and the nights when she'd collapse into bed, wondering if life would ever get better. But she also remembered the quiet moments of hope, the times she'd daydream about playing in front of a real audience, sharing her music with people who understood its depth. And now, those dreams were her reality. Her fingers found their way to the keys again, this time pressing down gently. A soft, haunting melody filled the air, drawing the attention of a few diners nearby. She played without hesitation, the music flowing effortlessly from her heart to her hands. It wasn't a performance, it was a conversation, a thank you to the universe for the unexpected blessings it had bestowed upon her. As the last note lingered in the air, Amara let out a deep breath. She felt lighter, as if the weight of her past had finally lifted. A waiter approached her cautiously, his face a mixture of awe and curiosity. "That was beautiful," he said. "Do you play professionally?" Amara chuckled softly, standing up from the bench. "Something like that," she replied, her tone warm but humble. She gave the piano one last glance before turning to leave. As she walked toward the door, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Every hardship, every moment of doubt, and every challenge had led her to this point. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time in her life, Amara felt at peace with where she was and where she was headed. She paused at the door, looking back at the restaurant one last time. The past was a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had carved out her own path, and it was nothing short of a miracle. With a quiet smile, Amara stepped into the night, the music of her life still playing in her heart. Thank you for walking this path of hope with me. If you're ready for another inspiring story, click the video to the left. And don't forget to subscribe. It's the best way to keep these stories alive. See you in the next chapter of our journey.